The relief he felt at seeing the king awake was soon tempered when, as he tried to rise to his feet, Jaehaerys instead crumbling to the ground. Both he and Arthur hurried over to him, and when they got there they found the king to be actually laughing. "It seems my legs are being most uncooperative, sirs," Jaehaerys said with a large smile on his face. One that Barristan was happy to see the queen seemed to be matching. "Lean on me, your grace," Arthur said as he knelt down and took one of the king's arms before wrapping it around his neck, Barristan quickly doing the same with the other. They helped him back to the carriage and placed him inside, the queen nodding to them both as she climbed in beside him, giving the orders to the guards that were with them and looking to see that Arthur was just as relieved as he was. They quickly mounted up and set off back to the Red Keep. As they rode, Barristan kept his eyes firmly on the carriage beside them, but he was soon moving a vent closer to it, the knight thinking something was wrong when the shutters were opened and both the king and queen's heads stuck out from inside. "Your grace, are you well?" he asked worriedly. "Very much so, Sir Barristan. My wife informed me that it's been a number of weeks since the people saw either of us. I'd seek to rectify that immediately," the king said. He found himself chuckling at that, and then feeling some pride when he heard the cheering of people when they saw both the king and queen, Jaehaerys and Margaery simply waving and smiling at them all as the carriage passed by. Barristan knew, though, how much it would mean to a lot to them to see them both. The small folk, too, had begun to worry about their king's health, and those steps had been taken to reassure them. No step they had taken would work as well as this one. By the time they reached the Red Keep, the word had spread. The crowds had grown larger as they moved through the city, and the cheers louder still, which had alerted those in the keep to what had occurred. Barristan saw the large party that awaited their arrival, the Lannisters, Starks, the Martells, and the Tyrells, all among many others that were represented. Moving to the carriage, he leaned inside to see the king was shaking his arms vigorously while trying to rise to his feet, and then he watched as he fell back to the seat. So he nodded to Arthur, and they helped him out from the carriage, both of them supporting his weight as they walked him into the keep. "I'll speak to you all presently, inside," the king said, and Barristan could see that he would need to do so almost immediately. Such were the eager looks on each of the faces. He also noticed that even the servants stopped to look and give both the king and queen warm smiles as he and Arthur helped him to his chambers. Once inside, it was to the large seat behind the desk. They moved the king at his behest rather than his bed or the more comfortable couches that were also in the room. It was something the queen wasn't best pleased about, but the king was insistent upon, and Barristan found himself smirking at the standoff that was now going on between them. "I need to speak to them, just to let them know I feel well and am unharmed, Margaery," Jaehaerys said. "You need to rest and to be looked over by the Grand Maester and your uncle Jay." Margaery replied, "I've rested for weeks, have I not? I have to this, my love, just to let them know I'm well. It'll be brief, and you can call for Gorman and Aemon before then if you wish," Jaehaerys said with a soft smile on his face. "I only want to be sure you truly are unhurt, Jay," Margaery said softly, and Barristan turned away to give them privacy as the king and queen began to kiss each other softly. It took some time for both Prince Aemon and the Grand Maester to be brought to the room, both men quickly examining the king and finding there to be no lasting damage or further injury. Barristan listened intently as both the prince and the Grand Maester explained that the reason the king couldn't rise or use his feet was nothing more than because he'd been abed for the last few weeks, and that over the next few days he'd gain his strength back. "Good, perhaps then I can put my own boots on and do so correctly," the king said, rolling his eyes as he looked to the queen, who Barristan was glad to see was grinning back at him. He could see there was still some worry in the queen's features, still some concerns even after the Grand Maester and the prince had done their utmost to reassure her and the king that all was well. Barristan could tell that she wished to just spend the rest of the day alone with her husband, but that circumstances didn't allow it. "Send for the others, sirs. I care not what order, but perhaps it's best to keep the young ones together," the king said. "And joy last of all," Margaery said, which had the king frowning until she nodded at him. "And joy last of all," Jaehaerys said. and Barristan set about doing as he was bid. The reunions were far briefer than either the king or those coming to see him wished for, Jaehaerys spending far more time with the children than with the adults, and Barristan wondering if the queen had told him that they'd not been allowed to see him when he was ill. Perhaps, though, it was simply they wished for more contact, as his words didn't seem to be enough for some of them. His sisters both needing to be held, and his young squire needing to have his hair mussed before any of them seemed to relax truly. As for the adults, it was clear to any just how relieved and happy they were to see the king up and about, or as up and about as he could be for the next few days. Barristan watched as his uncles, his aunts, Lady Olenna, and Sir Loras and the older Lannisters all made their feelings clear. Jaehaerys asking for a moment alone with Lord Jaime before giving word for the young Lannister girl Joy to be brought in. The smile on the king's face when he saw the young girl run to him was beaming. "I believe I have you to thank, Joy," Jaehaerys said as the girl sat on his lap before he could even bid her to. "Me and Balon, John, Margie too," Joy said, looking to the queen. "Woo!" "Aye, Margie too," the king said, smiling at his wife. "And don't forget Ghost and Rhaenys," the queen said. "No, we must never forget them, mustn't we not, Joy?" the king said, looking to the girl and nodding. "No, we must not," Joy said determinedly. Despite not being his blood as Daenerys, Sansa, or Arya were, or considered such by bonds of family as Prince Oberyn's daughters were, it was clear to any with eyes to see that there was no one who was more of a sister to his king than the girl he was presently speaking and laughing with. The girl had even managed to sneak into his chambers by herself, though she did have help from the Black Cat, he'd later found out. Barristan had wondered if it was that, the fact that his true sister's cat had taken Sowell to the girl that made them so close, but Sir Jorah had told him that it had ever been so. Back in the Rock, barely a day would go by and you'd not see them together, Lord Commander, inseparable the king and her. Sir Jorah had said happily. Arthur had suggested that it was the loss of family that drove Jaehaerys so. The idea of what had happened to Elia, Rhaenys, and Aegon that had made him welcome so many to replace them in his heart. Barristan, though, didn't truly agree with his brother on that. True, it played its part, but it wasn't the reason as far as he was concerned. Instead, he believed his king was good, true, that he was possessed of a heart that needed to be full, and so over time, he'd accepted people into it to make it so. "You can take the night, good sirs. I'll not leave my bed until the morrow," the king said as they helped him to it. "Food, Jay?" Marjorie asked. "Well, we'd best try not and make a mess, my love," the king said, making it clear he was staying true to his word. "We'll be outside, your grace," Arthur said before he could. "Take the night. Have some of Sir Bonifer's men take over door duty. Ghost is on his way and will be inside the room. Rest up, we've work to do on the morrow and you may end up carrying me around for a few days." The king said, both japing and seeming frustrated at the thought of it. "By your leave, your grace," he said with a bow to both the king and queen, receiving a nod from them both as he and Arthur turned to leave. Later that night he was sitting in White Sword Tower. He, Arthur, Jorah, and Walder, Sir Loras, and Sir Richard were on duty with other members of the royal family, and so it was just the four of them in the tower. They had eaten their meals and were now sitting at the table just relaxing after the day. It was rare that any of them would drink, even off duty. Both he and Arthur didn't truly partake, nor did Walder, and Jorah did so only occasionally. Tonight, though, he sat there and opened the bottle before filling out the 4 glasses with the finest arbor that he'd been able to find. He'd worried terribly. The thoughts of only just beginning his service with his king, only to see it come to a premature end, were ones that he'd tried his damnedest not to entertain, but ones that came all the same. 3 years he'd gotten to serve a good king before he'd passed, and then it had been followed with almost 4 decades of serving bad ones. So the fear that he'd spend even less time serving the namesake of the only other good king he'd served was a true and real one. Not even the calming words of Sir Walder had truly made his worries go away. His brother had told them all of the events in the Riverlands, and of just how strong magically their king actually was. It had been comforting, but not fully, Only seeing the king's eyes open and hearing his voice had been able to do that. To the king, he said, raising his glass. To the king. To the king. His brothers replied, each of them feeling just as he was, relieved and eager for the days yet to come. The Lion's Tale. 298 AC. AC. Benjen Stark. One thing became very clear not long after the two red priestesses arrived at the wall, and that was that one of them was anything but. Kinvara was most definitely what she said she was. Her mannerisms and the way that both of the guards deferred to her made that most clear. Val, however, was not, and it didn't take him too long to figure out that she was, in fact, a wilding. It made him wonder just why a wilding was coming with them to see his nephew and just exactly what type of mission Jay had sent the Red Priestess on in the first place. He had found himself excited to be leaving, though, to see his nephew once more, and to spend time with his other nieces and nephew as well. Sansa, Arya, and Robb had been fostering for some time, and it had been many years since he'd been lucky enough to see them all. How keen he was to see King's Landing or the Red Keep depended entirely on the thoughts which filled his head on which day. On some, he was lucky enough to just think about the family he had there now, while on others, his thoughts would go only to the family that he'd lost. Saying goodbye to the wall was not as hard as he'd envisioned it would be either. Not for him, and certainly not for Sir Alistair, Sir Jeremy, and the other loyalists. Benjen was, though happy enough that what it was gaining in experienced men far outweighed the loss of him and a few others. They'd also been lucky enough to be sent some men who would help out greatly. Some Dornish lords and knights who were most experienced, and Lord Stannis Baratheon, who he knew Jor would make great use of. As he put the final of his belongings onto the cart and turned to call for Frost, who seemed even keener than the Red Priestess to leave, he looked to see the Lord Commander walking his way. Well, Stark, I can't say I'm happy to see you leave, though you along with your nephew will see us right. A voice. Benjen, you have a voice at the table. Use it so we're not forgotten. Jor said, as his annoying bird called out for corn. I will, Jor. I'll see you again one day, he said with a smile. Aye, one day. Good fortune to you, Benjen. I'm proud to have served with you. Me too, Jor, he said, shaking the man's hand and then accepting the letters he gave him to deliver to his family, Frost finally coming to his side. They mounted up and set off and began the long ride to Eastwalk, Benjen finding that each mile he rode away from Castle Black made him feel less and less a Black brother even if he still wore the clothes. When he glanced at Kinvara and Val, he could see one looked to be as comfortable as ever. Kinvara riding her horse as if she was simply strolling through a meadow on a fine summer's day, while Val looked as if she wished to be anywhere but here. It took him some time to realize it wasn't the horse that caused her such discomfort, but the clothing. So as they camped that night and Frost went off to hunt, Benjen decided to rectify that at least. Here, he said, walking over to both Kinvara and Val and carrying the bundle of clothing before dropping it in the blonde's lap. What's this? Val asked almost angrily. It may serve you better than that dress you're so uncomfortable in, he said simply as he walked away and sat beside Sir Alistair on Sir Jeremy, both men laughing and japing as they told tales of Targaryens that were long since dead. The next morning, when he looked and saw Val on the horse, Benjen felt his breath catch and his throat begin to dry. He took a quick swallow of his water to both fix the latter and give him the chance to hide the former. Val was a beautiful woman, even when compared to the woman that she rode with. Seeing her in the red dress, he'd been like others, awed by just how pretty she truly was. That compared to now, though, was like night and day. If before she had been beautiful, then as she was right now, she was otherworldly, and he wasn't alone in noticing just how incredible she looked. As they rode over the next few days, he and others found themselves glancing at Val more than once, and by the time they finally reached Eastwatch, Benjen had reckoned he'd looked at her far more than the path they'd traveled. Frost had run ahead of them, the wolf off hunting in the distance, and only when the small village had come into view had he come back. Is that one of the king's ships? Sir Alistair asked, awed by the sheer size of the ship that was docked and waiting for them. "It is from the king's own design," Kinvara said, and Benjen's head turned to her to see that she was speaking true. If seeing it from the docks made it look impressive, then boarding it and being shown to their rooms only made it even more so. Benjen soon finding his cabin to be on a pat with the rooms he was given when he would return to Winterfell. Sir Alistair and Sir Jeremy and the other loyalists also were suitably impressed, but it was Val who was most so, both in the quality of her room and in the way the ship glided through the waters as if the waves barely registered when they hit against its hull. "I've never seen the likes of this," she said, standing at the bow and looking out as they sailed south through the Bay of Seals and toward the gray cliffs. "Not even in Essos?" he said softly. "When the fuck was I in Essos?" she snapped before she caught herself. "I knew you were a wilding," he said with a smirk as he looked at her. "Free folk crow. We're called free folk." She said her anger at him dampened slightly by her annoyance at herself for being caught out. "Why are you traveling to speak to my nephew Val?" he asked, and whether it was his concern for Jay that came across in his voice or expression, her features softened, and Benjen was almost lost in her eyes that for now looked bluer than the gray they sometimes appeared. "For help," she said softly. "Against the Watch?" he asked. "Against the dead," she said, catching him by surprise before she walked away. Benjen looked at her as she did so. Her breeches were a pair of his own that had grown too small for him, as was her shirt, tunic, and cloak, and yet she wore them far better than he or anyone else could ever have done. There was a grace in how she walked, and it was impossible not to see and acknowledge it. Benjen finding himself drawn to that grace and having to quickly turn away when his thoughts went far beyond any that he'd had in years. Looking out on the water as it seemed to almost part before the ship, he began to think about what she said. They'd hear tale of the wildings moving, talk of them banding together under yet another king beyond the wall. He, Jor, and others all dismissed it, given the nature of the wildings themselves, as they knew the wildings could never truly agree with each other on anything. But if what Val was suggesting was true, even if it was only believed so by the wildings alone, then it would give them a reason to choose another king and to join their clans with his. He turned to Frost and hurriedly walked from the bow, down the stairs, and up to the room before knocking hard on the door and waiting for the reply. Some of the other men stuck their heads out of their doors upon hearing the loudness of the knocks, but Benjen waved them away, and then finally, the door opened. His eyes were quickly drawn to the eyes of the woman in front of him, as were hers to his. "I've been wondering when you'd come to see me, Lord Stark," Kinvara said as she opened the door further so that he could walk inside. "King's Landing, 298 AC, J. Harry's Targaryen." He'd done his best to reassure everyone that he was well and that he would recover, some accepting it far more than others. His sisters being some of the ones who not simply accepted his words, and Jay had needed to hug, to speak softly, and to even laugh and jape with them before they did so. With some of the others, he knew there were more questions to be faced, but he found he was not ready to offer answers just yet. No, that wasn't quite the truth. He wasn't sure he had the answers to those questions himself, just yet. Joy, though, gods, just listening to her speak so excitedly and tell him of how she'd managed to sneak into his room and how Balin had helped her do so. Jay soon enough finding himself close to tears, he'd laughed so much, listening as she spoke so annoyedly about them not letting her come to see him and how much she knew that he needed her to. He'd done his utmost to reassure her that he was back and that he wouldn't leave in such a way again. Joy making him promise her, before she'd accept it, that along with a promise to go riding and to spend time with her was her price for her agreeing to leave that night, and it was one he gladly paid. "I thought they'd never go," his wife said as she brought the tray toward him, the 2 plates of food looking hot and appetizing, though he wasn't sure if he was truly hungry. He ate it all, though, cleaned his plate thoroughly as he knew that his family and the others were not the only ones who needed to be reassured. Jay had seen her watch him as he spoke, and when he was being helped to the bed. It was something she'd done even more keenly when he began to take food from the plate, and so, despite him being full less than a little way through, he'd finished it all and been rewarded with a full smile. "Leave them until the morrow," he said when she made ready to leave the room, Marjorie nodding and placing the tray on the table. "Ghost may have been expecting leftovers," she said with a smirk as she moved to the bed. "I'm sure he received great care and ate well when I was." Jay stopping himself when he saw the beginnings of a worried frown appear on Marjorie's face. He held his hand out, and she took it as she climbed into the bed, Jay putting his arm around her shoulder and Marjorie leaning in close to him. After kissing her forehead, he began to rub his arm on her back, feeling her lean in even closer to him. They lay there silently for a few moments. Marjorie obviously had questions, and Jay was trying to form the answers to whatever they could be in his mind, when he decided he was being stupid, and that he should be the one to offer up answers before he was asked. "I am well, Marge. I can't even begin to imagine how you felt, but I am well. I needed this, as hard as that may be to hear. I needed this to happen, and to happen here." He said. "Why? I don't understand. Tell me, Jay, please. I need to know all of it. Don't leave anything out," she said, and he kissed her forehead once more before nodding at her. He told her then about what he'd seen, what he'd experienced, and how some of it was real and some was not. Marjorie adding in little things that had happened while he was asleep, such as Joy coming to see him, her own conversations with him, and finally bringing him to see Rhaenys. She told him about his uncle coming and spending time with him and speaking on his mother, how she'd sat and listened as Ned had told him stories from his childhood. That's why it had to be here. What he showed me, what I saw, it was as if he created a life for me inside my head, a dream that wasn't a dream, and without it, without what you all did, then I think I may have stayed there," he said, and felt her stiffen against him. "You'd have left me alone?" she said, her voice sounding sadder than he could bear. "Never," he said, forcing her to look at him, and seeing the dampness in her eyes as he kissed her hard and deep. "Never," he said again, even more firmly, and saw her nod. Jay then explained what the dream had been, of how his family had been alive and he'd grown up as a prince in the Red Keep alongside them. He noticed the small smile that appeared on her face when he spoke of crowning her, his queen of love and beauty, and then of his joy when his father had announced they were to be man and wife. "But it wasn't real, it wasn't the same, was it?" she asked. "No, I saw ghosts and my mother and I don't. Something felt wrong and I didn't know now what it was, but now I do," he said. "What?" she asked, intrigued. "He didn't have the others there, the people I care about, the rest of my family. He had Rhaenys and Egg, my father and Elia. He had Dany and Viserys and my grandmother. He had my family, but not all of my family," he said. And she nodded as she kissed his cheek. "So you realized it wasn't true, my mother and Ghost. I think that was my uncle's stories. After that it was, I saw Rhaenyra, but it wasn't her. I mean, it was, but not only her. Rhaenyra from the dance. I saw her, but she was a young girl. I think that was Joy," he said, smiling as he told her then of the rest of what he saw. She listened as he explained about Dinas and about the book, about the fact that he would need to deal with Bloodraven and that he wasn't the only one that he'd need to face. Jay hating that he was worrying her so, but feeling that she needed to know the full truth. When it came to how he'd actually finally made it back, she looked on in shock as he told her that her bringing him to Rhaenys had been what had given him the strength to do so. "Magic, Marge, it's all magic," he said with a smile. They didn't lay together truly that night. Jay found himself tired, and Marjorie was far more content to just being held by him than to wish for anything more. He offered as much comfort as he could to her, and spoke softly to her until she finally drifted off to sleep. A promise that he'd be awake on the morrow being asked for and given before she did so. When he did wake, it was to her looking down at him, a smile on her face when she saw his eyes open. He tried to rise and stand and found some feeling was coming back, but there was no strength in his legs, and he fell to the ground. Sir Arthur and Sir Barristan both coming to his aid, and Jay then being dressed by his wife in his Kingsguard, much to his embarrassment. Not so much with Marjorie, as he knew by then that she'd done this alone all the while he'd been lost in dreams. But having Sir Arthur and Sir Barristan present was not something he enjoyed. Once dressed, they broke their fast, and Jay called for Jaime and Oberyn to explain to him what was going on in the realm, the time long past when they needed to get back to work. Finding out that Lady Catelyn had arrived and that Willis, Wyman, and Sir Richard had gone to Bravos amongst the many other things he'd missed, left him with odd feelings. Excitement knowing that Littlefinger would soon be trapped, along with his concern over how to handle Lady Catelyn and how it would be viewed by family and by others. He listened as Jaime told him of the few other events that had occurred, Harold Harding's raven among them, and his jape that perhaps the realm didn't truly need him, did not go down as well as he hoped. After that, he then met with the Grand Maester, who told him to do as much as he could with his legs, and that in a day or two he'd be up and about. Jay, feeling frustrated that it would take a little longer for him to feel back to himself. Once Gorman had left, Jay readied himself for the far more important thing he needed to do, the knowledge swirling around his head ever since he'd woke up. I need to speak to Aemon and the others. Can you arrange for them to come to me? Just the Targaryens, he asked. Sir Arthur and Marjorie looked at him. Am I to be excluded? She asked. No, my love, no. You'll need to be here for this also, he said as Arthur went to do what he requested. Beyond the wall, 298 AC. Leaf, the sap had worked completely, and hid her intentions and actions from the Raven, Leaf knowing then she could do what needed to be done. Each time she would stand in his presence and see that he was only seeing what he wished. It made her think about just ending him there and then, just taking her knife and sticking it through his one good eye. And if she believed that it would release her brother and sisters and protect her prince, then she would do it in the beat of a heart. It wouldn't, though, and her brothers and sisters would turn on her. And though her own life was a price she was willing to pay, theirs was not. So she instead came up with a different plan, and one which would require her to stay close and to do some of the things the Raven bid. Some, but not all. And should he ask her or any of her brothers and sisters to take a life, then she would act against him without hesitation. Acorn was first, then Twig, and then she moved on to the others, bringing them with her when she went to the tree and removed the sap, always waiting until the Raven was elsewhere before she did so. How she knew when he was looking at them and not at someone else was unknown to her. But she found that she was always aware. The feeling of being watched was not one that she welcomed, and yet one that she knew was very much needed, especially so that she could continue her work. What about the others? Twig asked her the day she turned him to their side. We must be careful, one and one only, even should it take us weeks or moons to bring them all, she replied. And once we're done, Acorn asked. I don't know. For now, let's make sure we free every one of us. She said to the days turned to weeks and then moons, Twig turning others when she could not, or Acorn doing so when Twig could not. Each of those she turned asked her questions that she had not the answer to, and Leaf had begun to wonder if she ever would. As it came down to only 2 or 3 of them left to turn, the questions became too much to bear, and so when she went to gather the sap, or when she made the paste for the Raven to eat, Leaf put those questions to the gods. It seemed as if she would receive no answers from them either, as she began to despair, to worry that there was indeed no plan, and if so then, what was she to do? Was she to simply wait, or to act, to stay to go? And if she was to leave, then where would there be safety for her and the others? Their prince would see them to safety. He would find them a home where they could live in peace. But until he came, if he came, a voice at the back of her head which she tried to ignore said, until he came, they would find no peace in the world of men. As much help as they may be able to offer to the free folk, what they were and who they were would soon see them turned upon just as they always had been. The word of men was not to be trusted, and even the smallest, youngest of their people knew this to be true. Without their prince and now without the raven, they were lost. Leaf wondered if perhaps it would have been better to have been left in blissful ignorance of the truth of the man they served. Still, she knelt at the tree when she could, and she prayed often, hoping for an answer to come. "You are our first, our chosen, and we would never abandon you," the voice called out as she knelt today. "You will not?" she asked hopefully. "We've shown you the truth. Why would we do so only to let you fall? I do not know such things as the minds of gods." "Why?" she said, though her voice, like the one that spoke to her when unheard to any other, as to all who watched it, seemed that she knelt silently in front of the tree. Mistakes were made, mistakes that even we could not foresee. But we've also foreseen the truth of things to come. We have sent out a prince that was promised, and that promise is soon to be fulfilled. "What do you wish from us?" she asked. "Prepare for what's to come. Gather your strength and free your people. The prince will do the rest. And the raven will soon face his own end." "What is to come after?" she asked. "When the prince comes our way, freedom and a place to call your own." The voice called out. Later that day, as they sat around the cave and ignored the calls from the thing in the tree, Leaf looked to each and every one of her brothers and sisters. They were free of mind and of anyone's control, free to make their own choices just as it should be. As the fire burned, she began to speak to them of the home they'd soon have, of the magic that existed there, and of how the gods had willed it so. "To the holiest of all places we shall go, our prince to see us safely there," she said, seeing the excitement rise on each and every face. "The island of the gods," Acorn said. Acorn said, "Where their eye sees all," Twig said. "The Isle of Faces," Leaf said, and she knew it was only a matter of time until their prince's own eyes looked their way. "King's Landing, 298 AC, Ned Stark." He knew that they'd be here now until the babe was born, and so he'd given leave to his lords and sent them back north. The Graydon Smulgens having already left as had Lord Domeric Bolton, Ned finding to his surprise that the young lord was meeting his newly betrothed along the way, that she was a girl from the Vale and a Royce, to boot, only making him wonder whether Roose would have allowed him to wed, and then raising questions over the Leech Lord's demise, questions that Elves soon put to rest, and which allowed him to wish the young lord well in his future marriage. He'd sent Ravens back to Winterfell to let them know what was going on and was now holding a dinner with Lady Jenna and Lady Myrcella. Ostensibly, it was to discuss her and Bran's betrothal and future seat, but more so, he could see how suitable the girl was for his son. The girl was soon showing just how nervous she was, and Ned tried to do his very best to offer her any reassurance that he could, once again finding Elle to be far better at it than he as she asked Myrcella to join her, though it had then left him alone to deal with her far more imposing great aunt. "My nephew will pay a dowry, of course, one which should cover the hiring of new guards and ensure the keep is more than adequately protected in the future," Jenna said. "I thank you, my lady, though it's not necessary. The wedding is at his grace's behest, and so no dowry is required." "No, perhaps not, but it will be provided all the same, Lord Stark. Which brings me to Myrcella and young Brandon themselves. I had wished to meet him, Lord Stark, to judge your son just as you are doing with my great niece," Jenna said, looking at him. There's no need to be coy, Lord Stark. I'm well aware of why you asked us to join you. As I said, I had wished to do so with young Brandon just the same. However, recent events have made that unable to occur, so I've a request to ask of you, one I'm sure his grace would agree to," Jenna said. "And that is, my lady?" he asked curiously. that when you arrive back at Winterfell and young Brandon and Sir Brendan head here to swear their fealty, they do so by ship and with a stop-off at Casterly Rock. It would kill two birds with one stone, so to speak, Lord Stark. I could take the measure of the boy who's to marry Marcella, and they both could actually get to meet one another as well, Jenna said. He looked at the woman and began to ponder her request. Despite the denials, that was exactly what he wished to do at this night's dinner, and so he felt he really couldn't deny her the chance to do likewise. Besides, it would be good for Bran to have some sort of relationship with the family of the girl he was to marry, and it could perhaps even smooth over some of the doubts that Marcella and his son would no doubt have. I can find no fault in your suggestion, my lady. I'll see it's done, he said as Elle and Marcella came back into the room, the girl seeming now to be in much better spirits. By the time they actually left, he found himself almost won over by the girl herself. She was smart and witty despite her young age, and though the wedding itself would be many years away, he could clearly see the benefits it would bring. Some of his bannermen had taken issue, not just with both Bran and Sansa now due to marry in the south, but with Bran being married to a base-born girl. Ned telling them to take it up with the king and to speak to him about Marcella's status if they dared. He knew full well that they would not, and if anything, it was truly only Rickard Karstark who was upset. The man had seen both Demeric and now Bran taken from his reach. Tough, a betrothal with Lord Hallis Hornwood's heir. Darren was now being suggested. You look tired, my love, he said to Elle as he tried not to think about politics and inconsequential matters and instead looked at his wife. I am, and my feet hurt, she said as she took off her shoes. Give me, he said, sitting on the bed and rubbing first one and then the other and hearing his wife's contented sigh as she lay back on the bed. He woke early the next morning and found that he was not looking forward to what he needed to do. The time was fast approaching and he knew he could put it off no longer, less so now that Jaehaerys was awake. Though he'd only spoken to his nephew briefly and knew it would take him a few days to turn his mind to Cat, turn his mind to her he surely would. So after eating as much as he could manage and rubbing Lya's head before letting her out to go and spend time with her pack while wishing that he could do likewise, he readied himself for what he must do. Ned slowly made his way down to the cells and was soon enough at the corridor she was housed in. He felt the sweat begin to pool on his hands when the jailer opened the door, and taking a deep breath, he walked inside. Ned. Oh, thank the Seven. I knew you'd not abandon me so, Cat said, and he looked at her and shook his head. Abandon you so? Do you think I'm here to help you after all you did? You truly think I'm here to come to your aid? He said disbelievingly. I did it for our children. Only for our children, she said, looking to him. For our children? He said, his voice raised. You did this for you, Cat, not for them. You think they wished it from you? That they'd have been happy if you'd managed to take their brother from them? He said, his anger forcing his voice to sound almost guttural. He's not their brother, she said spitefully. He is their brother. In each and every way he is their brother. He may not have come from you or from me, but don't you ever doubt that Jaehaerys is as true a brother to our girls or boys as they are to each other and to him. He shouted. So you'll do nothing to help me? You'll let him take my head or worse, feed me to his dragon? Do I mean so little to you now that you have your new wife? She said, her voice bitter and her face snarling, and Ned noticing just how old she had begun to look. I was not alone in marrying another. Now was I, Cat. Where is your own husband? Why has he not come to your aid? As for Jaehaerys, he'll show you far more mercy than I would were it my choice to make. Mercy? You expect me to plead for mercy from that? And she never finished as he moved close to her and saw her shrink back fearfully. Speak those words aloud, do so, and let them hear you say them, and see then what fate you get. Perhaps you'll find it's the one you deserve for trying to have a child killed, for hating someone who'd done no more to you than being born. And what of what you've done to me? she asked angrily as he stood and looked at her. "I've made my peace with it," he said, moving to the door. "Ned, please, the children, speak to him, to the king. Ask him to allow my children to visit me, to not keep them away from me in his spite," she said, and he looked at her and found that she was truly no longer a person he recognized. "You think they're being stopped from coming to see you? Are you truly that far gone? They're free to see you if they wish. Perhaps you should reflect upon that. They could come to see you, Cat. They just don't wish to," he said as he walked from the cell. He hurried away from the cell block and made his way up the stairs, seeing that Laya hadn't gone to her pack but had waited for him, and he was more than happy to see her there. Ned kneeling down and rubbing the wolf's head and feeling the calm come over him almost immediately. "Lord Stark?" He heard a voice call out and looked to see it was one of the men of the new royal guard. "Aye," he said, "from his grace," the man said, handing him a note which Ned quickly opened. Uncle Benjen has arrived with some other visitors. As much as I wish I could go welcome him myself, I find I cannot. I would ask you to join with Prince Oberyn and travel to the docks to welcome him and them. And if you could explain my absence, I'd most appreciate it. I'll speak to Uncle Benjen and to yourself later. But for now, I'd ask you to stand in my stead. J. Prince Oberyn? He asked the guard. Awaits, if you'd like to follow me, Lord Stark. The guard said, and he did so eagerly, finding he was most keen to see his brother again. And as he looked at Leah, he could see that he wasn't the only one who sought a reunion. Bravos. 298 AC. AC. Sir Richard Lonmouth. While he was worried about the king and worried for anything but what he came here for, he'd not have left. Richard knew how important this was to Jay. He also knew that despite him having very little actual power, the mere fact he lived and was free created potential problems for them. There was no telling what one man, especially if he was determined enough, could do. He was proof of that, as had been the spider. And he'd not allow Littlefinger to ever rise high enough so that he'd ever be in a position like that. Finding the man had been easy enough. Not only was Littlefinger a man who enjoyed his comforts and had the coin to provide for them, but like a moth to a flame, he too was attracted by something that he couldn't resist: power. So all Richard had needed to do was keep an eye on the Sea Lord's palace and an eye on the key holders of the Iron Bank, and it was with one of the latter that he found him with. Littlefinger looking almost ridiculously thin and small next to the large fat form of Bessaro Rayon. Following the man back to his manse, which though large wasn't as big as some of the others, Richard smiled when he saw the king's eagle nesting in a nearby tree. The large Westerosi bird standing out as most strange amongst the birds of Essos. Jay had told him that the eagle would lead him to Littlefinger, that he'd be waiting for him and would show him the way, but given what had happened to his king, it had not been so. Instead, it seemed the bird had just stayed close by and waited rather than seek him out. As he looked at it, he began to chuckle. Would he have found him through the bird had things been different? Would he have just sought the eagle out? Who could tell? As it was, he had no need to do so. He turned to Rylan and Dallor, the two bards both looking intently at the manse and the guards. "Well?" he asked. "A tough nut to crack, Richard," Dallor said. "Better to take him in the open," Rylan added. "We risk bringing the Bravosi down on us if we do that." Richard said to them, "Not if we do it right. The gate," Rylan said, and Richard looked at him, and then the manse. "What gate?" "The Mummers' Playhouse. It's owned by a man named Isambaro, the self-styled king of the Mummers. Every Bravosi with coin ends up at one of their plays, and on the night of a new one, those with the most coin always show up. The Sea Lord and the fat banker will no doubt attend, as I would expect, will our slippery friend," Rylan said, and Richard nodded, leaving one of the other bards to keep an eye on the manse and to make sure the mockingbird didn't fly off somewhere else. Richard walked with Rylan and Dallor to the gate and began to make his plans. There seemed to be only one route to the gate itself, and after speaking with Rylan and Dallor, they agreed on the best place to set their men for the ambush, and now all he had to do was wait. breaking his fast the next morning. With Wyman, he thought he'd found a potential flaw in his plans. The Lord of White Harbor telling him that the Blue Lantern and the Dome were actually where the great and good of Bravos preferred to watch their plays. Rylan, though, seemed to know far more about current events in Bravos than the large Lord did. That's true. But a year ago, someone tried to kill the Sea Lord as he sat in the Dome, and the Blue Lantern has fallen out of favor ever since their leading Lady Mummer married a visiting magister from Lorath. Rylan said, I knew there was a reason I kept you with me other than your skills with a blade, he said with a small laugh as he patted Rylan on the back. What can I say, sir? I like mummers, Rylan said as they walked to the small street they intended to use as their point of attack. When the day came, they were ready. Richard had set his men up at both ends of the street, the archers all bearing arrows that had been dipped in poison. It may not be needed, but he would take no chances that he'd lose the Mockingbird again. He'd arranged it with both Wyman and Willis to be ready to leave that day, nothing too hurried, as he didn't want to leave even the slightest suspicion that it was they who'd done this. But once they had him, there was no need to stay any longer than needed. It felt like an age until the sun began to go down and the day turned to night. Richard standing on the rooftop and looking down the street at his men and at the entrance to it just as keenly. Rylan had set the archers up, and Dalla would lead the men who'd handle anything on the ground. So there was no true need for him to be here, and yet he wished to see it through personally. He knew how much Che would appreciate this, and how long he himself had been waiting to see the Mockingbird pay. No, he had to be here. Sir, Braden said, handing him the pouch and pointing to the end of the street. And now it begins, Richard said, taking a swallow of the cooled wine and placing his hand on his sword, just as if he was down there with them. For a man who had incurred the wrath of a king with dragons, Littlefinger seemed very assured of his safety. At his manse, he had perhaps 40 or 50 paid swords in his employ, but he walked into the street with less than 6. Richard looked down to Rylan and saw the man and the other bards stand with their arrows ready to fire. And then when Littlefinger passed the point of no return, and when he was a little more than halfway down the street, the signal was given. Looking at the arrows fly through the night sky, Richard thanked the gods for a clear night with a full moon. It allowed him to see everything as clear as day, and he watched as the guards all began to fall. As quiet as it was, it also allowed him to hear the almost womanly sound that came from Littlefinger's lips, though he didn't hear the sound of the man's water as it dripped down his breeches and onto the street below. Richard, only finding out the man had soiled himself when Dalla and his men grabbed him and put the gag and sack over his head, and they then moved him to the ship. He sent one of the men back to tell Wyman and Willis that he'd meet them on the ship itself later that day, and the rest of them hurried through the city. The bright, clear sky was now a hindrance rather than a help. They passed by more than one guard patrol, though their presence wasn't detected, and finally they reached the docks and the ship. Richard not truly feeling comfortable until he had the man stripped and searched thoroughly and then tied up in the room. No one but one of our men, you understand, he said to Dalla as he organized the guards. I understand, sir, Dalla said, and Richard nodded, knew the man would do as bid. Wyman and Willis arrived just after noon, and both men were just as eager to return to Westeros as he was. Wyman looking at him curiously as the ship readied to set off. Did you catch a slippery bird, Richard? Wyman asked as the ship finally left the dock and was setting out to sea. Of course I did. I promised our king a present, and trust me, Wyman, this is one he very much desires, he said before turning to go down and speak to the Mockingbird and see what secrets he could learn and what offers the man would make should he release him. The first would be most welcome, the second ignored. The man had nothing he could offer him to stop what was to come. What was to come? Soon enough they'd be back in King's Landing, and the Mockingbird would face a judgment that was long overdue. Richard only hoped and prayed that his king had awakened by then to see it done personally. King's Landing, 298 AC. She'd read as much as she could and had even done her very best to remember each and every moment she'd spent with Brendan. Shiera quickly finding that some rocks were best left untouched and not looked under. Eamon had helped out where he could, both with the reading and with the doubts and concerns she raised about her own part in things. Not that anything he'd said had made her feel less responsible for Jay's condition than she did. It wasn't until news came of her nephew's recovery that she even began to move past blaming herself, and yet she knew that it would be a long time until some of the others did likewise. The Queen, for one, had blamed her, and rightfully so, Marjorie refusing to allow her anywhere near Jay's rooms, let alone her nephew himself. Others had soon come around to that way of thinking, and though none had spoken it aloud, they hadn't needed to. Shiera finding that unless she was on Rhaegal's back, she couldn't truly get away from the pointed looks and glares that people threw her way. To keep herself occupied when she couldn't get to fly on Rhaegal, and was in no mood to be subjected to the scornful looks she received on her way to Aemon's room, Shiera worked on enchanting more of the gems, finding one in particular which intrigued her and had taken most of her attention for the last few days. While not anywhere near as potent as her ruby, and certainly not Aemon's, she'd found that the small ruby offered some possibilities, and so she'd taken some blood from herself and from Rhaegal and had added it to it. It was finally ready to be used, and so, removing her own ruby, she stood in front of the looking-glass and placed this one around her neck. She watched as small things began to change, her eye color, her hair, little things, and she knew then it would work for what she wished it for, and she hoped that Jay would allow her to gift it to the girl. It was as she was doing this that the knock came to the door. Shiera, moving to find that it was one of the King's Guard and not an ordinary guard or servant who'd come to speak to her. "His Grace wishes to speak to you," Sir George said, and she nodded as she followed the man from the room. They walked through the corridors, and Shiera saw the looks directed at her once more, this time doing her utmost to ignore them. Soon enough they reached the king's chambers, and as she looked to Sir Richard and Sir Arthur, she was shown through to the room. Inside she found that Dany, Tyrion, and Aemon awaited, and as they stood there she could see they knew as little about this meeting as she, though Aemon did hold the Dreamer's Journal in his hand, and so she imagined it was about that. After a few moments, Sir Walder came out with Jay leaning against him, Marjorie walking alongside the knight, and glaring at her when she saw her. "You'll have to forgive the spectacle," Jay said as Sir Walder helped him to a seat, and Jay bid them all to take their own before sending the Kingsguard from the room. "You feel well, nephew?" she asked, receiving another glare from Marjorie and a smile from Jay. "Yea, I do, Uncle, the book if I may," Jay said, and Aemon handed it to him, Jay closing his eyes before opening it, and then handing it to Marjorie, and then to Aemon, Tyrion, Dany, and finally her. Looking down at the page, she could see the writing that was now there, and she turned to see that each of the others were just as surprised as she was. This was empty. Other than that one page, Dany said as Shiera flicked through to see that only that and this one had any writing on them. I know. That part you've just read. It's a song that Denise told me to read while I was dreaming," Jay said, holding up his hand to stop any questions. "The words themselves mean everything, but that's for another time. Aunt, you may need to read this," Jay said, closing his eyes and opening the book once more. She read through it quickly before dropping it to the floor. The shocked gasp she made causing Marjorie to rise to her feet, only for Jay to grab her hand and bid her sit. "The bookend," Jay said, and she bent down to pick it up and handed it back to him, watching as he opened up the page and showed it to Marjorie before then handing it to the others to allow them to read it too. This makes no sense," Tyrion said, and she was glad he had because she'd not been able to speak since she'd read the words that showed that her actions, that all of it was, or had been known. "How could she have known?" Marjorie asked. "Dennis saw the future, Marge, as clearly as any ever had. Some of it no doubt confused her completely, which is why the words don't fully fit, but you all read what it said," Jay said as Shiera thought on the words themselves. one eye of green and one of blue. Her aim may seem wrong, but is true. Though he thinks she does it for him, in truth, she does so for you. A prince must see what a raven cannot, travel where he can't follow. Though he'll fall today, none should fret, for he'll rise stronger and wiser on the morrow. Why, nephew, why is this needed? Aemon asked, and Shiera looked as Jay closed his eyes and held the book before opening it once more. Read it aloud, uncle, Jay said, handing Aemon the book. She moved forward in her seat and noticed that both Dany and Tyrion did the same, while Jay took Marjorie's hand in his own and brought it to his lips before kissing it softly. The prince that was promised will bring the dawn and sing the song of ice and fire. He'll wake dragons from stone, and what was lost shall return once more. The house of the dragon will rise and higher than it has ever done before, and the lands eternal shall be renewed and open once again. The dragon must have 3 heads, one who lives, one who died, and one who is reborn. Life, death, and rebirth, 3 heads, but just one prince to unite them all. He shall conquer life, death, and then he shall bring about the rebirth. The fight will come, but in the end, there can be only one. Aemon said, finishing reading the words. There is much that we must do, but first things first, it's time I paid a visit to a man with 1,000 eyes and one. Jay said, looking at each of them. Seeing his brother and a man who he later found out to be Prince Oberyn waiting for him on the docks was a surprise, as was the Red Priest and Priestess who were there waiting for Kinvara. He spoke to Ned as Frost and Lyre rolled around on the dock and introduced Val, Kinvara, Sir Alliser, and Sir Jeremy to Ned and Oberyn. After he did, they were taken to the Red Keep, though Kinvara left with the other 2 priests and told them she'd meet with his nephew another time. Hearing that Jon had been in some sort of dream state for the last few weeks and had only just awakened, had him at first incredibly worried, though he was soon relieved but both Ned and Oberyn explained that he had recovered and just hadn't been able to come and greet them personally. Sir Alliser, Sir Jeremy, and the Loyalists were brought to rooms within the Red Keep and told that Jon would see them soon, while he and Val were taken to rooms closer to his family. Val walking around the Red Keep almost in a daze as she looked amazed at the sheer size of it. This is where the king lives, she asked as they walked to the family wing. It is. We'll take you to him soon, Lady Val, Ned said, and Benjen saw Oberyn smirk and Val's frown. There are no ladies among the free folk, Ned, he said, seeing her nod to him. Forgive me, Val, Ned said a little uncomfortably. You're the Warden of the North, the Stark? Val asked. I am. And you? She asked Oberyn. Oberyn Martell, Oberyn said, dropping the prince bit to Benjen's surprise. When they reached what was to be Val's room, Benjen had to convince her that it was to be for her and her alone, and that he'd come by to show her more of the Red Keep and King's Landing in a bit. Val looking at him with what looked to be gratitude, and he felt a small stirring in his chest at the thought of doing something which made her happy. Ned asked if she needed clothing or wished to have a bath prepared, or if she was hungry, and Benjen found himself sensing the clear confusion that Val certainly was going through. The culture shock for him was something hard to get used to, but he at least had the experience of how lordship worked. For Val, having people do things for her would be much harder to get used to. Once she was in her room, Oberyn looked at him and gave him a very odd smile before bidding him and Ned a farewell, and Benjen followed his brother to his own room. Just looking around it when he got to it had him feeling just as strangely as Val surely was, and he began to panic, just a little at the thought that this was his life from now on. Ben? Ned asked, seeing his worried expression. What? Sorry. This is hard to get used to, he said, taking a seat. I know. You can turn it down if you wish, Ben. There is always a place for you at Winterfell, and I'll be building up some new keeps, should you wish to run one. I'll speak to Jon, he said softly. Jay Harris, Ned said with a smirk, and he looked at him while his brother explained that his nephew had fully embraced the name his mother had given him. Benjen, smiling at the thoughts of how Lyanna would feel about that, Were she here? What happened to him? He asked as Ned poured him some wine, Benjen looking at it and scrunching his nose. Had I known you were coming, then I'd have seen there was ale. We'll have some tonight, though. You'll eat with us, won't you? Ned asked. Aye, John, Ned. He listened as Ned told him what had happened, and whether it was that his brother didn't truly know, or that things were just that strange, he found that he was no clearer about the events than he had been before Ned explained. And he's well? He asked. He is. A little stiff and not able to get around easily, but he's well and will recover fully. Thank the gods, he said as he took a swallow of the wine, the taste starting to grow on him. Well, Ned asked. She's here representing the king beyond the wall. Our nephew sent Kinvara to treat with them, and Val was sent by this king, this manse raider, to arrange a parley with Joe. Jay, he said. A parley? Ned asked, confused. Val says there is an army coming for those beyond the wall, and when it's done with them it'll come for the rest of us, an army of the dead, he said, expecting Ned to laugh only for his brother to say nothing and just look at him. After a moment, Ned got up from his seat and walked over before he patted him on the shoulder and told him how happy he was to see him. El is close, and the Grand Maester says the babe will be born in the next few days. It's good to have you here for it, Ben. After dinner we can speak some more. There's something I need to tell you about Brandon. Brandon? He asked, confused. We'll talk later. I'll let you get settled, Ned said before leaving. He was in the process of doing just that. Benjen removing his clothes, or what few he had, along with the even fewer possessions that he cared about, and was placing them in the drawers when a knock came to the door. Stopping what he was doing, he walked over to answer it, and found Loras Tyrell standing there. The boy had grown a lot since he'd last seen him, and was now wearing the white cloak of the Kingsguard. Lord Benjen, his grace requests that you join him and her grace. Loras said, far more formal than he'd expected. Of course, Loras, lead the way, he said. Walking with the boy, the formality soon fell away, and he was most relieved by it. The idea of having to speak in such a way all the time was not something that he had ever enjoyed. When they reached what he assumed was the king's chambers, Benjen could see the two Kingsguard that stood there, and he was happy to see Jay so protected. Without a word, the taller man knocked at the door, and it was opened by Queen Marjorie herself. Benjen finding himself standing there staring at his nephew's wife, and just taking her in. She was incredibly beautiful, and the smile she wore only made her seem even more so. Uncle Benjen. He heard Jay call out, and he looked to see his nephew sitting on a couch, Marjorie closing the door behind him as he walked over to join him and took a seat beside the new king. King's Landing, 298 AC. Rob. He, Arya, and Sansa were finally allowed to spend some time with Jay as he recovered from whatever it was that he had gone through. Rob still unsure of what that was exactly. They made their way to his chambers, and he saw both Sir Arthur and Sir Loras to be on duty, Rob nodding to Loras before they were allowed into the room. Inside, Jay and Marjorie sat on one of the couches, Rob quickly noticing the crutch that leaned against the wall, and he saw Arya frown when she saw it too. Do you need that? Are you not able to walk? Arya asked worriedly, and Jay shook his head, bidding his sister come closer. Rob didn't hear what his brother said to her. He just watched as Jay spoke softly to their sister, his words going unheard to any but Arya and Marjorie, who was sitting close by. He did see Arya nod a lot, and then throw her arms around his brother, the two of them staying like that for quite some time while Jay rubbed her back and continued to speak softly to her. When Jay was done, he bid Sansa come to him and practically repeated the process, Rob happy to see there were more smiles and a little laughter when he spoke to Sansa. He took his seat and rubbed Ghost when he came near, the wolf almost checking that he and Arya were both all right before it walked over and lay down in front of Marjorie and Jay. After a few moments, Jay and Sansa broke from their hug, his sister wiping her eyes before she walked back to join him and Arya on the other couch. I am well, a little stiff, and it'll take me some days or a week or two to be back to myself, hence that, Jay said, nodding to the wooden crutch. Trust me, It's far more welcome than needing to be held up by Sir Arthur each time I need to move. Jay said with a chuckle. What happened? He asked and saw Jay look to Marjorie. It's hard to explain, but I'll try, Jay said as he began to tell them what he'd gone through. He listened with both Arya and Sansa looking just as lost as he was. Jay, speaking of magic and dreams, and of seeing his family in Valyria. Rob wished to laugh out loud at the ridiculousness of it all, but found he could not. His brother was speaking so seriously that he knew it was true, especially when he said that warging itself was just another kind of magic. Will it happen again? Sansa asked worriedly. I don't know, little sister, but should it, then you shouldn't worry. I promise. No matter what, I'll always come back. Always, Jay said, and he saw Sansa nod. Why weren't we allowed to see you? Joy was, but not us. Arya said, her voice angered. That was my choice, Arya. I thought I was doing what was for the best. I didn't wish to worry you all any more than you already were. And as for Joy, she snuck in. It wasn't that she was allowed and you were not, Marjorie said, looking at them all. It's not fair, Arya said, and he watched as Jay stood up and reached over to take the crutch, using it to walk over to them. Arya's anger at not being allowed in to see him was soon replaced by worry when she saw how Jay moved, Sansa quickly jumping up from the couch to help him over to them. And once he reached them, he knelt down and took Arya's hands in his. Sometimes life isn't fair, little wolf. Marjorie and the others thought what they were doing was for the best. So, Jay said, and he found himself grinning when his brother moved his finger to Arya's mouth as she went to speak. Should it happen again? Then we'll all know better, won't we? I'll be allowed visit Sansa and Rob, too, Arya said. And Jay leaned over and kissed her forehead. I'll make it a king's order, shall I? Jay said, grinning at her, and Arya finally smiled. They had some juice and some fruit brought in, and he drank a little while, ignoring the food. Sansa and Arya must have still felt a bit hungry, or perhaps it was because the peaches did look quite delicious, as each of his sisters ate more than one. Jay joined them, and soon the conversation began to drift to far more pleasant subjects. His upcoming wedding, Arya's training, Sansa starting to officially be a lady-in-waiting. Fun though it was, and as much as he may have wished to keep the conversations to that, he knew that he needed to ask Jay the other thing that he came here for. Jay, my mother, he said, seeing Sansa and Marjorie both suddenly wearing the exact same frown, while Arya bit her lip nervously. We've spoken of her, Rob. You know what is to happen. Jay said, his own tone much different now, too. I know. I'm not here to plead her case. I wish to speak to her, he said. Me too, Jay, please, Arya added, though Sansa stayed silent. You've not. I would have thought. Jay turned to Marjorie, who seemed just as surprised as he, his brother standing up and walking to the desk and grabbing some parchment and a quill. He wrote for some time before he looked over the words, and then blew on them to dry the ink and bid him come to the table. This will grant you access. I assumed you'd already been robbed. Forgive me for that. You can take as much time as you wish with her. Just show this to the jailer or to Sir Bonifer and his men, and they'll let you in. Thank you, Jay, he said, taking the note. Jay said goodbye to both his sisters with a hug and some whispered words before he nodded to him, and then using the crutch walked back to sit down with Marjorie. He bid them both his own goodbyes, and then he and his sisters walked from the room. Arya looked eager to go to see their mother right away, while Sansa looked anything but. Should we do this now? He asked Sansa, not needing to get Arya's reply, but he was surprised by his older sisters. You both can go when you wish. I've no desire to see that woman, Sansa said. That woman is our mother, Sansa, Arya said before he could open his mouth. Yet, I can't seem to care, Sansa said, walking away from them both, Rob wondering if he should speak to her or not, and deciding that now was not the time. He looked down at Arya, who seemed to be on the verge of tears. Robb realizing that perhaps she thought this meant that they'd not go either. "Do you wish to go now?" he asked, and Arya nodded vigorously. "Come then, let's go speak to Mother," he said, and took her by the hand. The walk to find one of Sir Bonifer's men was much longer than he had anticipated. Usually, the royal guard was everywhere, and yet for some reason there didn't seem to be any of them around. He'd almost given up hope that he'd find any when he saw Sir Walder walking his way, and so he moved to get the man's attention. "Sir Walder, Lord Robb, Lady Arya, been to see his grace, have you?" Walder said, looking down on them both. "We've been given permission to go and speak to my mother, sir, but I can't seem to find one of the royal guard anywhere to take us," he said, hoping that the man he'd known for most of his life as Hodor would offer to do just that, and finding out he was to be in luck. "Then let me take you both," Sir Walder said. Robb soon found himself chuckling along with the large knight as Sir Walder and Arya spoke of training sessions and of Brienne being his squire, Arya most keen on the idea of a lady knight. Robb was about to tell her that ladies can't be knights when Sir Walder told them both that it was only a matter of time until Brienne was dubbed so, Robb looking at the man to see if he was japing. He found that he wasn't, and Sir Walder explained what the duties of a knight and the code they lived by truly were, and how Brienne was just as deserving of it as any man. Robb looked and could clearly see the wide-eyed look Arya was giving him, and the excitement she was clearly feeling as she listened to his words. "Sir Maron," Sir Walder said when they reached some stairs. "Reveille, Sir Walder," the other knight said with a nod. "Lord Robb and Lady Arya wish to spend some time with their mother," Walder said. "Have they permission to do so, sir?" Maron asked, and Robb handed him the note that Jay had signed, the knight reading it quickly before speaking to him. "Follow me, Lord Robb, Lady Arya." They said goodbye to Sir Walder and followed the other knight down the stairs into a room with some guards outside it. Robb, waiting impatiently as the doors were opened and they were led inside. His mother sat on her bed looking down on the floor, and he noticed how old and tired she looked almost immediately. Before she even had a chance to look up at them or acknowledge their presence, he was almost brushed aside as Arya ran to their mother and threw her arms around her. "Mother, Mother, I've missed you. I've missed you so much," Arya said as the guards left the room and her mother looked from his sister to him. "Oh, thank the Seven, Robb, Arya, thank the Seven," their mother said, and the door behind him closed shut. King's Landing, 298 AC. Ashara. She put it off for as long as she could, Jenna, Jerian, and the others, all telling her that she needed to go and speak to the woman and tell her the truth about things that Ashara had felt she deserved to know. In the end, it was Oberyn who she went to for advice. Ashara having dinner with him and Ilaria and his girls, while Jerion did the same with Jenna and Kevin, and Kragan did with the Starks. She had to admit that sitting in a room that reflected Dornish culture was something she very much enjoyed. Ilaria had almost immediately redecorated her and Oberyn's apartments to reflect Dornish rather than Lannister or Baratheon tastes. To eat the food from her homeland was something she enjoyed even more. The spices felt so familiar on her tongue, and the Dornish sour was more welcome than the Arbor gold she'd become used to in the West. As for the company itself, Oberyn was his effusive self, and while she'd barely known Ilaria from her time in Dorne, she could tell very quickly that had she then, they'd have been firm friends. Oberyn's girls ranged from the studious Sorella to the warrior-like Obara, and seemed to fit every single example of Dornish woman in between. Tyene was soft-spoken and seemed almost innocent. Nymeria was flirtatious and effervescent, and the younger girls all tried to copy their older sisters as best they could. Ashara had hoped that Arianne would have joined them too, but the princess was eating with what was soon to become her good family. Oberyn telling her that the dragons were having their own family dinner that night. "You did not wish to attend?" she asked Oberyn, knowing how much he thought of his adopted nephew. "I wish for our own dinner with my nephew and niece, and given my girls, it's for the best we don't share our time." "Time," Oberyn said, his smile, ever present as he looked down at the two youngest who were speaking animatedly to each other. "Jay seems to be well, recovering well, that is," she said, taking a sip of the wine. "My nephew is far stronger than he looks, and he also has more than one wedding that wishes his attendance," Oberyn said, leaning forward to kiss Ilaria. Ashara smiled at that. She'd heard that Oberyn was to marry his longtime paramour, and it was clear to any who looked just how much he loved Ilaria. That they'd not married before, now she could only put down to Doran, Elia's brother always having his own motives for each action he took, or did not. "It will be in Dorne?" she asked. "Of course, the same week that Arianne is to marry," Ilaria said, smiling. "Then I look forward to seeing Sunspear once more," she said, smiling back just as truly. They spoke then on days long past as they ate and drank, neither she nor Oberyn willing to hit upon subjects that brought up bad memories, and instead speaking on the ones that only led to good ones. Stories of their days at the water gardens and growing up as children, tales of Oberyn's mother and of her own. When they spoke of Elia, it was of those days only, the young and carefree days when the world had not yet shown just how cruel and unforgiving it could be. Ashara welcomed the reminiscences. The warm memories of her friend were ones that she could look back upon with joy. But soon enough they were being infringed upon by the memories that none of them wished to think about. Ilaria, noticing the change of mood and using her children to make them forget and place those memories aside, for now at least. Ashara was soon laughing loudly as Dorea spoke of her own days in water gardens, and as Loreza named her sister a coward for being afraid of the water where she was not. "Nim, Tyen, take your younger sisters to their rooms. It's time they were abed," Ilaria said when the dinner ended and Oberyn looked her way. "Mama," Elia said, pouting. "No, little snake. You have a busy day with your father on the morrow. Now go, or I'll make you stay here with me. I'm sure there is some embroidery I can find for you all to do." Ashara laughed at how quickly the girls moved after that. Oberyn telling her they were going hunting in the Kingswood on the morrow, and his daughters proving themselves truly their father's children, as they'd not risk that would not be the day to come. When the youngest were asleep, Sorella, Obara, Nim, and Tyene came and bid their father and Ilaria good night, the girls soon leaving them alone as they headed out to enjoy what King's Landing had to offer, and Ashara found she envied them their youth. "So it brings you our way, Ashara. Not that I'm unhappy with your company," Oberyn said as he sat beside Ilaria on a long couch while she sat across from them and faced them both. "Catelyn Tully," she said, and saw the angered look that soon appeared on Oberyn's face. "The trout, why care you about her?" Oberyn said as Ilaria rubbed her fingers over his arm, the effect almost instantaneous as Oberyn calmed. "I don't. I could care less about her. And was she not locked in a cell in the dungeons then? I'd not give her the time of day. But she is, and soon she's to face punishment for her crimes and for what she tried to do to our nephew Oberyn. Were that enough then, I'd perhaps wish to speak to her, to give her a piece of my mind. But you know why I'm thinking of her," she said, and Oberyn nodded, though it was Ilaria who nodded. "You wish to speak to her about Brandon, about Cregan," Ilaria said. "I feel I must," she said softly, "to explain. To explain why you owe her no such explanation, Ash. He loved you and not her. Any with eyes to see would know that to be true," Oberyn said. "He was betrothed to her. No doubt she thinks me a seductress, a wanton woman who lay with her intended, and as I said, were she anywhere but here, I'd care not. But here she is, and I'd have her know the truth before she faces her punishment for what she did. She'll not believe it, Ash. Lord Jaime told me that Stark went to see her, and she thought he was there to rescue her, that he'd come to stand up for her after all she'd done. The woman has lost what little sense she has, Ash. Seeing you won't make her believe the words you speak, and you may risk her own hurting you, far more than yours hurt her," Oberyn said. "I don't wish to hurt her, Oberyn. I wish her to know the truth about me and Brandon, about Cregan, for whatever good it will do. I just want her to know," she said, and Oberyn shook his head while Ilaria nodded. Then you should go, but be wary, Ashara. As Oberyn says, the woman has lost her senses. You may not wish to hurt her, but she very well may try to hurt you, physically or worse, with words alone. Ilaria said sympathetically. She bid them good night and walked back to her own rooms, checking in on Joy and Cregan once she got there. Her son asleep with his wolf at the end of the bed, and Joy with Balerion on hers. Girion was sitting up waiting for her, and so she walked over and sat down on his lap, telling her husband what Oberyn and Ilaria had suggested, and she listened to him as he told her that whatever she wished to do, he was with her. They made love, and he held her through the night. Sleep for her was hard to find, and when finally closed her eyes, she was awake, what felt like moments later. She rose and dressed before she broke her fast with her husband and their children. Ashara, waiting until Joy went for her lessons and Cregan had set off to spar before she told Gerion that she was ready to speak to Catelyn Tully now. He walked her down to the cells and he waited for her as she was led inside. Then, for the first time in 7 and 10 years, she was face to face with a woman she'd once pitied, and who she now only scorned. Lemon warning. Those who don't wish to read it, just skip this POV. King's Landing, 298 AC. Marjorie. He'd been getting stronger the last couple of days and was almost moving around without the use of the crutch, only keeping it with him just in case rather than out of a pressing need. As she lay in the bath and felt the water and soap run off her skin, she was sure she was being watched, and when she turned around, she saw him standing there. The look in her husband's eyes was one she'd longed to see since he'd awakened, and one she'd very much missed while he'd been asleep. Marjorie heard the almost gasp he made when she stood up and turned to face him. She then saw the way his tongue rolled over his lips as he took in the sight she offered him, and she felt her own need begin to rise. Slowly, she stepped out of the bath and reached for the towel, only to find it nowhere in sight. And when she looked at Jay, she saw he was smiling like an errant child. As much as she wished to call out when he walked from the room, she found that she was enjoying the game too much to do so. So with the water still dripping from her body, she followed him into their bedchambers. Jay sat on the bed as if he was waiting for her, and so she walked towards him, only to move away from him, just as she reached him. "No, I don't think so," he said as he reached out quickly and grabbed her hand, Marjorie laughing as he pulled her down to the bed. "Now, I believe we have some time to make up for, so I hope my wife has no plans for the foreseeable future," Jay said as he rolled on top of her and was soon looking down at her. "Well, I did have." "Jay gods," she said as she felt his lips on her neck. Within moments was moaning loudly as her husband put his incredibly talented tongue to work, firstly licking every single drop of moisture from her body, and while in one way he was making her drier in another, he was very much not. That he spent so much time not actually touching where she wished him to touch, or kissing where she wished him to kiss, was both incredibly frustrating and also unbelievably exciting. Marjorie, finding herself moving to try and get him to take her nipple in his mouth, or squeezing her legs together to try and trap him when his tongue licked the inside of her thigh. She saw his own desire was just as strong as hers when he looked deep into her eyes and leaned forward to gently bite her lip, his tongue soon fighting with her own for control as they kissed. When he whispered what he intended to do to her in her ear, she felt the goosebumps rise on her skin. Even more so when he put into practice the things he'd promised he was about to do. "Jay, yes, yes," she said when she felt his teeth gently bite her breast, and she almost screamed out when he took her nipple in his mouth. It didn't take her long to actually scream out as she felt his fingers slide down her stomach and between her legs. Their journey thankfully reaching its destination, and soon enough, they were making themselves very much at home. How he was able to curl them up and touch her both inside and out at the same time she couldn't tell. But when she felt herself grow close and felt him touch her nub, it was the gods themselves she thanked. When he then brought them from between her legs and placed them in his mouth, she felt herself ready to rise once more, her hands almost pushing his head down as his lips began to make the same journey that his fingers had only just traveled. Feeling his lips, and then his tongue, her back arched of its own accord, and soon her hands were pulling on his hair as she felt the waves begin to rise. She almost passed out, and whether it was from the pleasure she'd just been given, or the fact that it had been more than a moon since she'd felt it, Marjorie couldn't tell, and she found that she didn't care. Instead, she wanted more, and when she felt his tongue begin to work again, she knew that she'd soon be feeling it all once again. Jay! Jay! As she finally began to calm, she was happy to see that her husband had decided not to be idle, Jay undressing far more quickly than she would have liked, and yet his hurry only fueled her own desire. When he was standing naked in front of her, she reached up and grabbed his hand, pulling him down to the bed. Marjorie laughing when he did before she moved up from the bed and climbed on top of him. She then pushed his arms down and held his hands to the bed when he tried to touch her. Now, my husband is not the only one who wishes to explore," she said as she leaned forward and gently bit his ear. Soon enough her tongue was tasting his body, and while he didn't have the moisture from the bath for her to lick up, she found she enjoyed the taste of him all the same. She kissed his lips, his chin, and his neck, and even found herself taking one of his nipples in her mouth, wondering if this was what it felt like when he did the same to her. Feeling the way he moved beneath her as she did so, she began to think it was, and so she continued to gently suck on it before she began to move further down his body. Hearing him moan when she took his manhood in her hand was a most welcome sound to her ears, Marjorie happy that she could make him feel the same as he did her. "So hard for me. So hard for me," she said as she softly blew on his member, and the reaction she got only made her wish to do so again, Jay almost jumping up from the bed when he felt the warmth of her breath. She leaned forward and stuck her tongue out, the tip of it barely making contact with the head of Jay's manhood. Marjorie, though, found to her disappointment that there was no taste of him on her tongue when she brought it back into her mouth. Moving even closer, she rolled her tongue against his cock and finally tasted him, her lips soon covering the head as she wished to bring him the same pleasure that he did her. An inch, 2, maybe even 3, she began to enjoy the taste of him and the reactions her lips and mouth provoked. When she saw the look on Jay's eyes as she looked at him, she felt herself grow bolder, and so she took even more of him inside her mouth. Far too soon she felt him begin to shudder, his eyes looking down pleadingly at her, and his lips pursed as he bit down on them with his teeth. Taking him from her mouth, she began to move her hand up and down his shaft, and she looked on as the fingers of his hands began to open and close. "Marge, Damn." He didn't need to say any more as her hands moved faster now, and soon she was looking on in fascination as the shaft began to pulse and the tip seemed to expand. How many spurts erupted from the top of his manhood, she couldn't tell. Her eyes were almost drawn to the sight as she watched as the white creamy fluid fell down upon her husband's stomach. Jay shuddered, and then he stopped, Marjorie looking up to see that his eyes were closed, and before she knew what she was doing, her tongue was reaching out to touch the tip once more. It was salty, and she found that while she didn't quite like the taste, it didn't repulse her either. Then, as her tongue began to clean up the pool of it that lay on his stomach, she watched as Jay's eyes never left her own. Moving up his body when she was done, she lay on top of him, Jay's arms wrapping around her as she kissed him and felt him kiss her back, Marjorie glad that he didn't seem to hate the taste of himself from her lips as she had not when she tasted herself on his own. They lay that way for a bit, Jay stroking her hair and kissing her softly as she snuggled against him. Feeling him begin to rise again, she looked into his eyes and saw how hungrily he was looking into her own. I want you inside me," she said. And he kissed her before he rolled on top of her. Marjorie looking on as he rubbed his manhood against her, and she felt just how hard that he truly was. He was gentle when he began to push inside her, and she was surprised that despite how much she wanted him to do so and how ready she was for him, that it still hurt just a little. Jay noticing and taking every effort to make it hurt as little as possible. Even when he was fully inside her, he didn't move, and instead just let her get used to his size once more. Marjorie feeling her body relax, and then nodding to him and telling him she was ready. When he rolled over so she was on top, she looked down at him, sure he was making a jest. But Jay just shook his head and placed his hands on her hips, Marjorie feeling the pleasure as he lifted her slowly up and down. Soon she was moving forward too, and then she felt something give inside of her, the movements forcing her breathing to grow shallow and a flush growing from somewhere inside her chest. Her release when it came was matched by his own, and as she collapsed against him, she felt herself begin to cry, Jay not understanding and thinking that he'd hurt her. "I'm sorry, gods, Marjorie. I'm so sorry," he said over and over again as she shook her head and kissed him and tried to find the words to tell him how she felt. It took some time for her to calm enough and for Jay to stop apologizing, the two of them laying on their sides and looking at each other face to face. "You didn't hurt me, Jay. I swear it. You did anything but hurt me," she said, reaching out to rub her hand through his hair. "Then what?" "You were crying, Marge. I saw it. I heard it," Jay said, his voice full of worry and concern. "I think it was because a part of me feared that we'd never, that this, us, that it would." "Too," she said, struggling to get the words out as he looked at her. "What did I tell you? It's us, Marge, you and I, always. Nothing will ever come between that. Not magic, not blood raven, nothing. You and me together, always," he said, kissing her as she kissed him back. King's Landing, 298 AC. "Sir Boniface," he looked in the mirror, and the older man who stared back out at him was one he barely recognized. His thoughts having been confused ever since he'd looked into the glass candles with Daenerys. Boniface would find himself looking at the princess and seeing not her, but her mother, knowing that it was only that Daenerys had a much different personality that had allowed him to not think of her as simply Rhaella born again. As he dressed and looked at himself, he found himself closing his eyes, his fingers touching the place where only recently a gray beard had grown. Boniface shaving it off after seeing how he'd once looked, and now not sure if he'd been right to do so. The world he knew now, and the world that had once been having almost merged into one, and he'd found himself looking and seeing ghosts wherever he walked. He saw the men who stood by and had allowed her to be treated, so were now wearing white cloaks once more. Even though Jaime Lannister was not, in Boniface's mind it was hard not to see him in one, as he did Arthur and Barristan. It was harder still not to feel anger when he thought of them and what they'd done and not done. When he looked at the princess and saw her with Aurane Waters, it had been hard for him to see them both and not see Aerys and Rhaella, and at times he'd almost come close to running the man through. Boniface walked from the looking glass and sat down on the bed, and before he knew what he was doing, he was laying back and picturing what he'd seen. The images in the glass candles were not like any memory he'd ever known, and instead had felt as real as if he'd been once again reliving the days a few weeks ago. He and the princess walked to the king's chambers, both of them feeling equally as nervous as the other. Boniface nodded to Sir Walter, who opened the door, and when they walked inside, they found the king was already waiting. Daenerys greeted her nephew warmly, and he was happy to see it return the same way. Jaehaerys bidding them both to take and seat, and then picking up a chest from the ground. He looked on as he took the glass candles and a jar of what to Bond seemed to be blood and placed them on the table. "You're both sure you wish to see this?" Jaehaerys asked them. "I need to, Jay," Daenerys said as she looked to him. I'm sure, Your Grace," he said. He watched as Jaehaerys opened the jar and began to pour it on the green one, while the black one was moved in front of him and the princess. Once it was almost covered in what he now was certain was blood, Jaehaerys looked to them both, and Bond watched as the king closed his eyes and the flames began to light. A moment later he almost fell to the ground when he saw the image began to appear. "I would ask for your favor, princess," the young knight said to a giggle from the silver-haired woman in front of him. "You are bold, sir. To think a princess would be willing to see her favor worn so publicly," the woman said. "Well, since we already have the boldest of knights, perhaps I'm just following in Sir Barristan's footsteps, though if memory serves me he wished to ride for glory when I only wish to ride for love." the young knight said. "O Bon, the words you speak," Raella said, smiling as she handed him the favor. "I speak the truth, my princess, my queen of love and beauty," he said softly. The images changed, and Bonifer saw that Daenerys was looking at him as much as she was at what the candle showed, her fingers brushing away a stray tear that had begun to fall from her eyes as she did so. The last man fell, and the crowd cheered as he rode over and picked up the garland before riding to the royal box. He could see the excitement in her eyes as he drew ever closer, and then he moved the lance so that it was facing her and her alone. "Princess Raella, I would name you as the Queen of Love and Beauty." Bonifer felt Daenerys' hand touch his own as the images changed once more. His eyes focused on the glass candle as he wondered what it would show. Raella stood in front of the looking glass, her white dress and small crown making her look like the maiden herself. She seemed to take a deep breath, and then the tears began to fall, Raella moving to the bed and crying loudly as her body heaved. It was never to be him. It was never to be him. Come for me, my knight. Come and rescue me from what my life is sure to become. I need you, Bon. I need you to come and take me from this place, Raella said as she began to cry even louder. She was standing in front of the High Septon, and her distress and upset was clear for all to see, the man beside her paying her no mind. Raella was doing her duty and marrying her brother as her father had demanded of her, and as the bells began to ring out, a lone horseman rode through the Kingswood, the horse changing direction and heading north now rather than south. It had been until the bell had rung out and made it clear he'd been too late. He closed his eyes and didn't see the images change, only the sound of the pained gasp from the princess beside him, forcing him to forego his own pain and concentrate on hers. As he looked to the king, he saw the sympathy in his eyes, and he welcomed the nod the man gave him before he turned to look down at the glass candles once more. "I will not stay here, heiress. I do not trust Pycelle, and I will see my child born," Raella said. "You dare defy your king, whore. Do you forget your place?" Aerys said, his long hair and nails showing just how close to the end this was. "We don't know where Rhaegar is, and the rebels rise, Aerys. Dragonstone is safer for me and the children than here. Or do you wish to see yet another of our children not live?" Raella said as Aerys slapped her hard across the face. "Don't ever speak to your king in such a way. You don't wish to wake the dragon, do you?" "No, but I'd see another dragon born, my love. Another dragon like you," Raella said, her voice changing now. The boat sailed, and she stood on the aft looking as King's Landing faded from view, her belly swollen and her hands holding it tight. "You will live, by the gods. They'll all feel my wrath should you not," Raella said. The storm raged outside and the screams rang out around the keep, men and women running to and fro, and a worried-looking maester looking down at the pained woman in the bed. Her silver hair lay all across the pillow, and her hands gripped the sheets as the sweat poured down her cheeks. "I cannot be certain you will live, my queen. I can save you or the babe, but not you both," the maester said. "My child, you save my babe, you hear me? My queen, think about what you're asking of us." Sir Willem Darry said, "My child, Sir Willem, you save my babe, don't make me order it." Raella said, "You heard her grace," Sir Willem said. The sound of the babe's cries were heard over the storm, her violet eyes open and wide even as she cried out. On the bed the woman was weak, and yet she reached out for the babe, and the maester handed it to her. So, as if all it had wanted was its mother's touch. The babe suddenly stopped crying, and Raella looked down at it, her strength almost seeming as it had returned to her as she held the babe close. "Daenerys, my sweet, sweet Daenerys, look at you, so strong, so beautiful. I wish I could be there with you, to hold your hand, to see you grow into the proud, fierce young woman you'll surely be. Were it left to my will and my will alone, then nothing would stop me. But we all are here by the will of the gods, and the gods alone make that choice. Know this always, though. It was you I choose, and it was one of the only choices I got to make in this world that was mine own. My queen, Sir Willem said, reaching out to take the babe. Go, take them. Go, Sir Willem, and know you do so with your queen's gratitude. Rhaella said as Sir Willem took the crying babe and hurried from the room. Rhaella turned her face from the door, her tears falling from her eyes as she looked out onto the bay, her breathing growing shallow as she turned her head back. Look over them both, my son, my daughter. Protect them and let me see those that I wish to hold once more. Shayna, Daron, Aegon, Jaehaerys, Rhaegar, your mother is coming home, Rhaella said as she breathed her last breath. The flames burned out, and Jaehaerys moved even quicker than he, the king holding Daenerys in his arms as she sobbed against her nephew's chest. He couldn't hear the words he spoke, but he did see the nod he gave him as he motioned to the door. Bonifer getting up and walking to it and sending Sir Walder inside, and then he, the king, and the giant Kingsguard helped Daenerys to her room. Now, he moved from the bed and wiped his eyes. The tears had come to him, as they had at least once a day ever since he'd seen the images the glass candles showed. It had taken Daenerys some time to come back into herself. And though she had, Bon had caught her looking to him occasionally with a sad look on her face. It was one that he was sure he'd worn often too. Getting up from the bed, he finished dressing and readied himself for the day ahead. He left the room and prepared to face the ghosts, and as he began to walk down the corridor and toward the princess's room, he did so with only one clear thought in his head. It was the same one he'd had since he'd seen the vision in the glass candles. Every time he thought back on the final words she'd spoken, he'd found himself more and more sure it was to him that she spoke. He'd not been able to protect her son, to look over him as she had wished, but he could do so with Daenerys, and he would. I'll protect her, my love, my life for hers, and one day I'll see you again, he said softly as he saw the princess smile as she walked from her room towards him. King's Landing, 298 AC. Cat. For some reason the dreams had stopped. Cat not sure why that was, but welcoming it all the same, and yet sleep still eluded her. At first, it had been because she feared what may come to her when she closed her eyes. But then it had been because she feared what was to become of her now that she was in the dragon's lair. Each visitor only making her more and more certain that the dreams themselves would come true. She'd been furious when the Lannister had come. How dare she judge her for things she knew not? It hadn't been her family that the bastard had intended to usurp. No, her family had benefited from having him in their home. As he has yours. Cat shook her head and ignored the voice, just as she had done ever since she'd started to hear it speak to her. Ever since Jenna Lannister had come, it had become something that had been happening more, and when Ned came, it had only gotten even worse. Cat, hearing the voice each time she brought up her reasons for hating Jon Snow in her head. He wanted to usurp Robb. Did he? He was a threat to my family. Was he? He is a bastard. Is he? The voice not agreeing with what she would say, and Cat hating hearing it, as it sounded more and more like her father or her brother, her uncle or her mother, and even Brandon from time to time. She was sitting in her cell trying to get the voice to leave her alone when the door opened and Robb and Arya walked in. Cat welcoming the feel of her daughter's arms around her and looking up to see her son, though when she looked behind him she didn't see Sansa anywhere in sight. Arya never let go of her hand even when Cat had her sit on the bed beside her, her daughter looking up to her lovingly while Robb bore a very different expression on his face. Cat sat silently as Arya told her about her fostering, and while she wished to speak out about it and how wrong it was that she was doing as she was, she felt it best she did not, instead simply nodding and letting Arya's presence be enough for her. Robb is to be married soon too, Mother. I hope you can come. Arya said, and Kat looked to Rob, whose expression was telling her all she needed to know about that. Her presence would not be welcome. She could clearly see in that look. You need to admit what you did, Mother. To stand up and say you're sorry for it. Perhaps then. You need to admit what you did, Mother, Rob said. You expect me to apologize to him after all he's done, she said, feeling Arya move from her. All he's done. Was it him who sent assassins after himself, Mother? He who tried to have himself killed because he feared what he may do. No, that was you. All you, Rob said. Rob, I did it for you, for Arya, for Sansa, for all of you, she said, and Arya looked at her and then her brother. You did it for me. I never asked it of you, nor did Sansa or Arya. Do you think any of us wished our brother dead, Mother? Rob said angrily. He would have taken Winterfell from you. Khan, she said. Ignoring the voice which said that he was king of Westeros and Winterfell was a very small prize compared to that. God, do you even listen to yourself, Arya? Come on. There's not talking to her, Rob said. Rob, Arya, please don't go. I'm sorry, She looked on as Arya moved to her brother, her daughter with tears in her eyes as Rob led her from the cell. Kat not sure what she'd done or said to make them leave. You tried to kill their brother and told them you did it for them. I did do it for them, she said to the voice as the cell door closed. Did you? Her meal came and she barely ate it, Kat instead laying down and falling asleep. The dreams that came were far more pleasant, and she found herself standing looking down as Rob sparred in Winterfell. Sansa came running up to her with Arya beside her, both girls dressed in the prettiest of dresses and holding out their embroidery for her to look at. Show your father, girls, she said, turning to the tall, dark-haired man beside her, Brandon smiling as he cheered their son on and looked at what their girls had made. Beautiful girls, just like you both and your mother, Brandon said as he leaned in and kissed her cheek. When she woke, it was to the cell door opening, and she looked to see the woman standing there, Kat almost rising to her feet when she heard her speak her name. The door closed behind the woman, and Kat took a good hard look at her. Ashara Dane, not looking as if she'd aged but a day from when she'd seen them all fawning over her at Harrenhal. What do you want? She asked, looking at the woman. To speak some harsh truths, Ashara said. Of how you seduced Brandon and bewitched him, she sneered. You really didn't know him at all, did you? He was to be my husband, she said loudly. Yet he married me, Ashara said. And her words took her own away, but only briefly. You think I believe your lies, she said. Out of the two of us, I believe I'm the only one who speaks the truth, and the only one who's never tried to kill a child, Ashara said. Had I known of your own bastard, then it would have been him that I'd have seen dead. The slap was hard, and she went to rise to her feet, only to see Ashara reach for something at her hip, and she worried that the woman was carrying a knife of some sort. Instead, it was a handkerchief that was thrown to her, and Kat threw it to the ground, having no intention of using anything that belonged to this woman. Your father knew of my marriage to Brandon. He knew but kept it from you. He demanded that Rickard Stark annul it and force Brandon to wed you against his will. Whether you believe it or not, I care not, but I felt you were owed the truth. It was never to slight you or even about you. We met. We fell in love, and had things not turned out how they did, then who knows what the realm would be like today. I told you, I care not for your lies, Kat said, turning away from Ashara. You knew so little of his true nature, but you knew enough. How do you think he'd have reacted to being told what he must do, Catelyn? Do you really think there was a force in this world that could make Brandon Stark do anything but what he wished to do? You wrapped your legs around him and gave him what I would not until we wed. That's all you were to him, Ashara, a cheap whore that he could spend inside and father a bastard upon. Me he loved, she said, and Ashara laughed. I was told you were deluded, so lost in your own fantasy that you'd not listen to what I had to say. It seems they were right, and I was wrong. Well, so be it. I know the truth, and perhaps one day you will too. Either way, it was me he loved, me he married, and me he had a child with, Catelyn. Do with that what you will." When Ashara left, she began to cry, thinking back to those days and to how, while not cold, how inattentive he had been. Cat had been sure that he, like Robert, was sleeping with other women, but she was sure also that once they were wed, it would stop and be only her and him. It had never come to be, and as she sat there in the cell alone, she began to think that she'd never truly known what love had been. She'd not had it with Brandon, Ned, or with Petter. The only true love she'd ever had was with her children, and she'd lost that because of how she'd felt about Jon Snow. Had you but loved him, the voice almost mocking her as she cried against the covers of the bed. The true depths of the situation she now found herself in finally hitting home. King's Landing, 298 AC. Jaehaerys Targaryen. Each day he felt stronger, as though he begun to welcome more and more visitors. Robb, Arya, Sansa, Joy, Willem, and Martin. Tommen, who was eager to get back to his duties, and Oberyn, Ilaria, and his cousins. He promised Oberyn that he'd eat with him and his family as soon as he was properly up and walking without aid. Aemon and Gorman had said that would be in the next few days, and Jay found himself hoping they were right. With others, he spoke only briefly at Marjorie's behest. Her own family, Jenna, Jerian, and Ashara, and even his uncle Ned were only allowed brief visits. Apart from Jaime, even his aunts and uncles weren't really allowed to spend much time with him, though in Shiera's case, it was because Marjorie still hadn't forgiven her for what had happened. Nothing he said could change her mind on it, as though he'd given up trying. Marjorie saying that had she not acted how she had, then he'd have never fallen in the first place. Jay, though, wasn't completely sure that was the case. The words in Daenerys' journal becoming more and more clear to him. One line, in particular, kept playing out in his head as he read the journal over and over. Though he thinks she does it for him, in truth, she does so for you. It had made him think about events even more clearly. Shiera believed that Bloodraven had predicted what she would do if she saw the pin, and had played her almost to do as he willed. Jay, though, wasn't as convinced. In fact, he was beginning to be certain that he'd instead just seen it and taken advantage of it, that he'd not actually planned it, but more, he'd simply known it was going to happen. He spoke to Aemon one day about it, and his uncle told him something that he found most interesting. Marwyn always said that prophecy will bite your prick off every time. It's a treacherous woman, and like all things that are treacherous, it's to be handled with care. Aemon said. Jay, though, had a different take on it, or at least when it came to himself and his role in prophecy, he did. There was truth, and then there was what people were allowed to believe was the truth. The line between one and the other was based not on knowledge, but on design he'd come to believe. Dennis's journal had been hidden. Why? Even when he found it, there was a bloodlock on it. Why? As he looked at it, he'd known that he wasn't to be allowed to see the truth in it. Not then. Why? It's not for him to see. The thought came to him and he knew it to be true. It wasn't for him to see, it was for Jay to see. It was locked because it couldn't be seen by someone who hadn't been written for, and so over time people had taken fragments from it and thought them to be what was truly said. The prince that was promised would bring the dawn, he said, looking at the words in the book. But what exactly was the dawn? He looked over the words more and more as he tried to make sense of them. And then it hit him, and he found himself writing one phrase down over and over again on the paper. The lands eternal shall be renewed and open again. Valyria, he said as he began to read more. He shall conquer life, death, and then he shall bring about the rebirth. Conquer life. Was that beating Robert and regaining his throne? If so, then what did conquer death mean, and what exactly was the rebirth? Death, life, rebirth. The dragon had 3 heads. He, Rhaenys, Valyria, rebirth. It was there. He could almost reach out and touch it, and yet it began to fade away. Jay looking at the book and finding himself moving to other pages and watching as words began to appear. The doom comes for us all, wolf and dragon, old and new, one king to unite them all. To go forward, you must go back. Love is strength. Jay found that certain phrases popped out at him, and yet the words around them almost seemed faded, as if now was not the time to know their truths. Instead, he found himself at the one other page that the writing was clear, and he began to read it aloud. Where the dragons make their lair amongst the salt and smoke, where the black stone fills the walls, the truth lies, and weapons are forged. Weapons of steel, of glass, weapons that can defeat death itself. The dragons know, they've always known, Jay said before he heard a cough from behind him. Jay, Marjorie said, and he turned to see his wife standing there rubbing her eyes. Who were you speaking to? No one. I was just talking aloud, he said, closing over the journal and reaching for the cane. You let me sleep, she said, a little annoyed as he walked towards her. You were tired, he said as he kissed her cheek. I wanted to spend the day with you before the trial, and before we needed to get back to being king and queen. I just wished to spend the day alone with you, she said. And he nodded. I know, but you needed to sleep too, Marge. You can't spend all your time looking over and making sure I'm well. It takes too much out of you, he said, looking into her eyes. I know, she said, and he kissed her softly, both of them growing equally annoyed when the knock came to the door. He turned to walk to it, but she brushed past him and opened it herself, and he was surprised to see Jamie walk in with a worried look on his face as he did so. Jamie, he asked. We need to talk, Your Grace, Jamie said. A few moments later, he, Marjorie, and Jamie were walking to the reception room a few doors away, Jay glad that Jamie had set him up in here. Sir Arthur and Sir Barristan walked behind him while Ghost was in front of him, and he saw that Sir Richard Horp and Sir Walder were on guard at the door, along with almost a dozen royal guards. Far too many, he felt, for one man, even one as dangerous as Victarion Greyjoy. Sir Richard opened the door and Jay and Marjorie walked in, Ghost moving to stand between him and the Lord Captain of the Iron Fleet. He saw Asha sitting beside her uncle and how the man looked at the cane in his hand. The almost half grin that came to the Ironborn's face would be one he'd take pleasure in wiping off. First, though he needed to hear it from the man himself. Not that he disbelieved Jamie, but more so he could make it clear what he intended to do. Euron, he said, without taking a seat, intends to sail the Iron Fleet and attack Westeros, Victarion said. Where? He asked. I don't know. If I was to wager, I'd say the Reach, but I can't be certain. My brother's plans are changeable. And he has all the Iron Islands at his command? He asked. Along with pirates from the Stepstones, Your Grace, Asha said. Why should I believe you? He asked Victarion. I came because I heard you name my niece Lady Reaper. I hold no love for my brother, and with him in charge, it will be worse for my people than it was with Balon running things, Victarion said. If I find you're lying to me, Greyjoy, then I'll take pleasure in feeding you to my dragon. Tro, he said as he looked to the man. Your ships will burn. Either way, some, if not all of them. But if I can get to Euron first, then perhaps it will be fewer. He wants you to come. He has a horn. He says it's a dragon binder. He wants you to come to him so he can take your dragon, Your Grace. Asha said, and Jay began to laugh. Oh, I'll come. But the only thing he'll be getting from me or my dragon is fire and blood, he said, turning and walking from the room.